Welcome to the Traction Reaction Podcast. I'm Steve Zaki. Joining us today, it's the author of The Legend of the First Super Speedway, Battle for the Soul of American Auto Racing, Mark Dill. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing terrific, especially since you have invited me on your show. I'm honored.
This is long overdue. Our project has certainly been a labor of love. And, this isn't something you just took a couple months off and did it. This is actually, it's taken quite a few years, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah, a lot of years. And, some of it was conceptually, and then I was working inside corporations that had nothing to do with auto racing and a lot of pressure there. But, I was ruminating it in my mind. But, I was talking to Don Kay earlier today, and more than anything, it wasn't just how long did it take you to write it, Mark? It was how long did you take it to research it?
Mm-hmm.
And I write it like a novel. It reads in the entertaining fashion of a novel, but I dare anyone to prove that it's not factually based. I date things, I say where they happened, and that's the way they happened. But I do get inside the heads of, in particular, Carl Fisher and Barney Oldfield, and tell it from their perspective.
Well, for those listening who might not be familiar with the book, it takes place in pre-war in the U.S., pre-World War I, that is. Starts about 1902, and it's written from a unique perspective where you wrote it in the perspective from Barney Oldfield and Carl Fisher, who are certainly two pillars of early automobile racing.
Yeah, I mean, and they had some differences in their personalities, as we all do, but they had a lot of similarities. And I wanted to write it in a pretty unvarnished fashion. I don't want to candy coat things and, turn them into cartoon characters. I mean, some of the things that both of them did, people would be uncomfortable with today to discuss,
Mm-hmm.
but that's who they were. And it was a period of time that's interesting to me too. We're talking about the era of like Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight fighter. The level of just, it would curl your hair sometimes if you saw in major publications or websites, what have you, the language that was used. That was like, for example, Jack London, who wrote The Call of the Wild. And a lot of people of my age remember reading that as young boys. Man, that dude, he had a lot of problems with people, black people.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just part of the backdrop to this, and the way they treated women, and I don't focus on that, but it's in there because that's the way it was.
Yeah, Barney Oldfield, he's one of these larger than life characters. He kind of did things his own way, was a barnstormer, and started off as a bicycle racer. Kind of put us in the head of Barney Oldfield, what kind of person he was. People may have heard, they know the name, but they may not know the person.
Yeah, you're right. He's still a name that rings a bell with some people. As time goes by and generations pass, it's less and less. And that's part of the reason I want to write it too, is like, no. We need to understand who these guys were. And frankly, the success of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and in particular the Indianapolis 500, rides on the momentum that was created by Carl Fisher back in those days. And subsequent generations have largely been caretakers of that. And while they've made really good contributions, Carl Fisher is very much alive in everything that happens at that track. For example, he was the first man to run a pace car. No other race had ever had a pace car before. Mm-hmm. And he drove it. And then also after a year or two, he came up with the formula along with the AAA to determine how many cars should be on the track during a rolling start. And it was 33. and they were spaced by a certain distance each row. Well, that's what happens today. And I like to think about, and I want people to know that they did so much. It's something that we need to appreciate. They made something that we all love.
One of the people you have in there, and is to most people, in my opinion, is totally forgotten, is Tom Cooper. And Tom Cooper was explained to me by Al Krause, the historian at the Milwaukee Mile. He explained Tom Cooper as somebody he kind of came up with Henry Ford too. He was involved with Henry Ford a bit, and then later with Barney Oldfield. But Mrs. Ford was not a fan of Tom Cooper. Thus, he was kind of person non grata to Henry Ford and his endeavors after she said that, wasn't he?
Yeah, no, that's a little bit funny, but I mean, I think approximately what she said was she didn't like the way he consorted with low down women. And so I think she was afraid that he was somehow going to influence old Henry into playing behind the scenes. And I don't think Ford was built that way, but nonetheless, that was Tom Cooper. And, he was such a important part of Barney's life. And I don't want to have any spoilers here, but the first roughly half of the book is a real buddy story between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly is. One of my favorite chapters is because that's one of the things I like to drop on people who may not know the history of the Milwaukee Mile. Was back then there were actually a lot of 24-hour races. Mm-hmm. And when you think 24-hour races, of course, you think of Le Mans and Daytona, but these were certainly different. These were more endurance races. And the way it was explained to me, that these were just ways for the automakers to prove that their products could work.
Yeah. And that was important because these things were just being introduced and people were skeptical. And, a good example of that, and you're 100% right. A good example is is the November this month, the 24-hour race, if you will, that Carl Fisher and Art Newby promoted at the Hoosier 100, that Hoosier State Fairgrounds, Indiana State Fairgrounds track. And they wanted to set the world speed record for 24 hours, the most distance covered. And, that's what they were up to. And they ran for 24 hours. They had two cars. One of them crashed, but the other one finished. And they set the world record. And they called these events grinders. That's what they were called, how they were promoted. And you saw them really all around the country at these different horse tracks. I mean, what a world.
Yeah, I'm sure the horse people weren't too happy how the track looked after one of those races back then. Racing in during this time, pre-World War I, was a lot different than it was even just before World War II. Whereas, as you were saying, the automobile was in its infancy. They would have these events. They'd barnstorm from town to town, and which I think you really bring out in this and nicely in the book, how these guys would travel to, whether it's Michigan, Ohio, to the fairgrounds like you mentioned, but these weren't 100-mile races. These were like heat races and speed events, weren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were. I mean, you look at those early race meets, and they would hold a dozen or more races, but a lot of them were just 5-10 miles. And that was true even of the first races at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And, they had a few longer races, and that's where they got into trouble in 1909 with all the fatalities. But no, you're 100% right. It was just a different beast. But the thing I like to think about in all this is that the people watching it, if you can imagine, we're talking about the early 1900s. Well, the majority of adults at the time, they weren't raised in an era where there was automobiles.
Mm-hmm.
It was all horse and buggy, and a lot of them were still using horse-drawn conveyances to to do their work or to just travel to wherever they wanted to go. And for Barney, and he had this promoter by the name of William Pickens, who's another guy that's been forgotten, but he was quite a character. And they go around, they promote these things, and that they were going to remote places in the country, rural places where no one had even seen an automobile before. So if you can imagine from the fans' perspective, what they were seeing was just astonishing. And even though it was just maybe a couple of guys going around the track at like 50 miles an hour, that may sound boring today, but for then, it was like, oh my God, I can't believe these guys are doing this.
Yeah, certainly were. And the story I remember Al Krause told me was, you mentioned this about, horse riding, or they took the train to
Yeah,
the racetrack, which was one of the reasons why the Indianapolis Speedway was built right there, because there was a train stop right there. Same
right.
thing with the Milwaukee Mile. There's a train stop right just to the north of the fairgrounds. And one of the stories he told me was the Milwaukee Sentinel photographer would take photos at the racetrack, and there was a like a flop house type thing. He would take his glass negatives, shut down the bathroom so he could develop his glass negatives in the bathtub, and then he'd give them to the train man, and the train man would take them downtown to the Sentinel so they could be in the papers and the next day.
Yeah.
That's how quickly they could do it back in 1905. So, but yeah, kind of put us through. Tell, is there a certain anecdote that kind of sticks out from the book, how that that kind of explains how different times were back then?
Well, what's funny is everything you were saying talks about the differences, but people don't appreciate that news was traveling at the speed of electricity, 186,000 miles per second. And at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I know in the first 500, but in the races prior, they had a bank of telegraph operators, and the news reporters would come and give them copy, and they'd bang it out to the newspapers. So there were like, for example, in the first Indy 500, there were like 3 editions during special editions during the day for the Los Angeles Times. And in the continental United States, that's about as far away as you could go. And so they were getting their information maybe a lot faster than people appreciate. And the telephone was viable then. So it's just interesting to me, and what I tried to convey in the book was that we weren't really primitive here. It isn't like we had an internet, but we weren't doing Zoom calls. But information was spreading very quickly. Barney went from being basically a nobody that people maybe knew in the bicycle racing circuits, but after he beat Alexander Winton in 1902, he became a national celebrity. And it was because you could disseminate news pretty quickly. And so I don't know whether I really answered your question about how different it was. It was obviously different. But I think what's interesting is, well, there was some similarities. They they got the word out.
They certainly did. Um, Before the Indy 500, there was the Vanderbilt Cup, and kind of walk us through how that came about.
Yeah, 1904, and I worked with a gentleman who also is behind a really uh, good book. His name's Howard Kroplik, and he lives
Mhm.
in Long Island. Very well-to-do man, very knowledgeable, successful businessman. And the book is the Vanderbilt Cup Races of Long Island. So I'm very familiar with that history, and it really kind of brings up this cultural tug of war, which is why I wrote the subtitle in my book, The Battle for the Soul of American Auto Racing. Very much like today, you had these East Coast, particularly Northeast, what they viewed to be elites, and I guess they were elites, and they had opinions, but they were very proper. They didn't believe in professionals. If somebody was a professional driver like Barney Oldfield, they kind of looked down their nose at him.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them had inherited their money. So they're just sports that want to play.
Right.
But that's the way they were raised, and that's the way they saw the world. And William K. Vanderbilt Jr., I actually give him a lot of credit. There were people, he had a cousin, Reginald Vanderbilt, who was just a total playboy. He died an early death from excessive alcohol consumption. But William K. Vanderbilt Jr., while you could fairly say he was kind of a spoiled kid, he tried to do things that were productive. And so he had been over to Europe quite a bit. He had a continental education. He'd been to European races, and he had actually driven in them. And he drove in a race in Belgium that was sort of an early prototype for the Grand Prix and finished third out of a field of 150. So this guy knew how to drive. And he was convinced, just like Carl Fisher, that America's industry was in jeopardy. So he comes back and he says, we need to run a big road course. It needs to be international. We want foreign competitors over here because we need a wake up call for the American manufacturers. And he brought that together for the first time in 1904. And Barney was there, but he didn't race. And he was kind of walking around checking it all out. And he had a bit of an inferiority complex, a little insecurity, and he was very envious of William K. Vanderbilt for all his wealth and his influence. But I think in a lot of ways they complemented each other, and in the end, it was beneficial. So again, I just want to present people as they were and not pass judgment on them, and in that way bring people around hopefully to where I am on all that,
Mm-hmm.
is that these were human beings, flawed like we all are, but they made quality contributions to the sport we love.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Yeah, because there's all these little nooks and crannies in motorsports that most people aren't aware of. I've had a friend of mine that exposed me to, 1920s, 30s, 40s sprint car racing and
Yes.
front neck Fords and Kragers and all sorts of, interesting engine and overhead valve conversions and whatnot. It's a whole different world. This is, this pre-war stuff is really, really interesting. And I certainly appreciate you coming on the show. Oldfield was certainly the speed king, as he was known, and passed away in 1946. Any other final thoughts on Barney Oldfield or on the book you want that you want to mention?
Oh wow, there's so much. I would say that in the book, I hope people discover some people that had made tremendous contributions, like Ernie Moroz, who was really the first general manager of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but he was like a premier promoter. I mentioned Will Pickens. I try to portray some of the relationships among the founders of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Frank Wheeler, for example, liked to needle Art Newby. Newby was more of a churchgoer, and the other three were, guys that liked to toss back drinks and, have a good time. So the personalities come out, and that was what I was going for, and that's what brought me greatest joy, because they can't be, like I think I said earlier, like cartoon characters. They're human beings, and I think I give people a chance to get to know them.
Well, I really, it's a fantastic book. Like I said, one of my favorite things are books that are able to place you back into that time. When you're reading it, you feel like you're there. You certainly did that. Of course, we're talking to Mark Dill, author of The Legend of the First Super Speedway, The Battle for the Soul of American Auto Racing. It's certainly recommended. And what's the easiest way to get the book, Mark?
Well, it's available. It's only sold online, but Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Target, and if you're in England, Blackwell's. And then also for autographed copies, you can get it at markgdill.com. And I'm delighted to sign a nice note, and my my name, and God bless everybody.
Well, and plug your website too. It's
Thank you.
the it's a great website too for
Yeah, if anyone's interested in, well, what was the source information? And again, this backs up my position that this is a very factual book, even though it's written as a novel. Um, my website, firstsuperspeedway.com, has a ton of primary research on there, and it's loaded with content. I'm totally uh, confident that I can say that it's the largest consolidation of pre-World War II or pre-World War One automotive racing content. You could waste hundreds of hours, going on that and reading it, but it's all, I try to provide my interpretation if people just want an executive summary, but the articles are there, they're attached. And if you want to dive deep into any particular topic of that time, it's there for you.
And it has a large archive on my favorite pre-war driver, David Bruce Brown,
Yes.
who unfortunately was killed a year in Milwaukee in 1912 at the Vanderbilt Cup. But yeah, it's a fantastic website. It is an archive of pre-war stuff. It's fantastic, good stuff. Thank you for taking time out, Mark. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching the Traction Reaction podcast, and make sure to like the podcast and subscribe below.
Thanks. You asked great questions, and I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.